Hi, y'all. Good morning. We're going to start chapter 4 now. It is called A Deserter and a Death. The title always makes me think about what the chapter is going to be about. And by reading the title of that chapter, kind of frightens me a little bit as to what we're going to read about, but it's part of the fun. Okay, July 11th through late August, 1804. Stooping over the campfire, York scooped out a spoonful of steaming hot stew and blew on it. Seaman sat up, his eyes begging. The delicious aroma made him drool. Two long strings of saliva hung out of his mouth, one on each side. All right, big fellow, York said, chuckling. Here's a taste of what I'm cooking. York flicked a piece of meat onto the ground for Seaman. Seaman scrambled to his feet and snatched the piece of meat instantly. He spat it out. Now you know better than to grab a piece of meat that came right out of a boiling pot, York scolded. Weren't you watching me blow on it here on this here spoon? Seaman rolled the meat along the ground with his nose, licking it tenderly. York sipped the liquid in his spoon. I think our supper's ready to eat. What do you think, fella? At last the meat was cool enough for Seaman to grab. He swallowed it in a single gulp and looked hopefully at York. York frowned. Now look at that. You swallowed your meat so fast that you couldn't even taste it. York flicked another piece on the ground. This time, slow down and chew. While York cooked, the captains relaxed by the fire, their writing desks on their laps and quill pens in their hands. Each captain had an open bottle of ink and a journal to write in. All around the camp, the other explorers sat in the groups around fires, cooking and writing, talking and eating. Lewis looked up from his writing. You know, William, I'm awfully surprised that we haven't seen any Indians since we left Camp Wood. Clark nodded. By my estimate, we've come over 100 miles over 500 miles from the Missouri. There's plenty of game by the river. I thought surely that we'd meet up with a few Indian hunting parties by now. The trip has gone smoothly, Lewis said. He looked around the peaceful camp. Perhaps too smoothly, Clark said. Lewis looked puzzled. The men have gotten too relaxed, Clark explained. Trouble never seems to come when you're prepared for it. It's when you forget to keep a watchful eye that the problems develop. During the night, the man was discovered asleep on the guard duty. That jolted the captains. Anyone could enter an unguarded camp, steal supplies and guns, and even kill the soldiers. The men needed to take their responsibilities more seriously. This, after all, was a military expedition into unknown territory, not a vacation trip. Under military rules, sleeping on guard duty is such a serious offense that it can be punished by death. The sleepy guard was put out on trial and sentenced to 4 whippings, 25 lashes a night, a severe punishment intended to keep future guards from making the same mistake. Seaman's instinct was to protect each man, but Lewis called him aside this evening of the first whipping. Sit, Seaman, he said. Stay. His voice was clear and firm. Seaman sat, but sprang to his feet when the whipping began. Lewis told Seaman to sit again and kept his hand on the dog's head to remind him. Whining softly, Seaman watched one of the men whip the guard's bare back. He could smell the guard's sweat and the blood on his back. Although the guard gasped with pain, the whipping continued, 25 lashes. When the whipping was finished, Lewis strode away into the group. The seaman trotted behind him. Although every man in the Corps of Discovery thought of Seaman as our dog, he was the Captain Meriwether Lewis's dog first. Scene change. On July 14th, Seaman went hunting with Captain Clark and some of the men. The hunters came upon some elk near the river. The men fired, but their gunshots missed. The elk leaped into the river and started to swim away. Seaman charged into the river and swam furiously, clamping onto the young elk. Seaman managed to break its neck and haul it back to shore. Clark and the men cheered as Seaman swam toward them with the game. The expedition reached the Palette River by late July. On the 13th of July, the captains took a walk on the prairie. The fertile land that stretched before their eyes seemed endless, the sky enormous, A mild breeze rustled the tall grass. Seaman roamed beside the captains. He sniffed the ground and followed the scent trail left by a rabbit. When he discovered the dried remains of mouse, he nudged his stiff hide. Then he rolled over, rubbing the scent onto his fur. Lewis whistled, and Seaman scrambled to his feet and ran to the captains. The long grasses tickled his whiskers as Seaman pushed through them. Like a puppy, he leaped into the air and snapped the grasshopper. The captains laughed and ruffled the fur behind his ears. They walked until they came upon a pond. Swans were gliding across the clear water. Seaman stood poised and waiting for the command to drive the water in pursuit of the swans. Instead, the captain stood as still and silent as the tree trunks. The men's eyes drank in the beauty that surrounded them. They couldn't think of the words to capture how they felt. That evening, as they returned to camp, they were greeted by the smell of fresh catfish frying over open fires. Lewis turned to Clark and clapped Meriwether's hand on his co-captain's shoulder. "There you are, man. That expresses it." Clark was puzzled. "Whatever are you talking about, Meriwether?" Lewis grinned. "The words we lacked on the prairie. When I smelled the fish frying, it came to me. This land is a feast, and a feast for the eyes, the mind, and the belly." Clark laughed. "Meriwether, you astonish me. You're as tough as a buckskin on a surface, but beneath it you have the soul of a poet." The amazing richness of the land continued to unfold before them. In a month of August, the expedition finally met up with a party of Indians. The Indians visited the explorers' camp on August 2nd. Using gestures, they introduced themselves. They were from a tribe known as the Oto. With hand signals as well as short English words, the captain managed to invite the Oto visitors back for a meeting the next morning. The men of the expedition dressed in their military uniforms for the meeting. Captain Lewis and Clark even put on their cocked hats. Before the Indians arrived, the men prepared the camp for company. They drove poles into the ground and draped the keelboat's sail over the poles to provide shade for the meeting. The Indians arrived about 10 in the morning. Lewis gestured for them to sit beneath the sail. Seaman was edgy with so many strangers in the camp. He sat apart from the Indians, but stayed nearby so he could watch both the explorers and their gestures. Once the Indians were seated, the explorers lined up and marched military style. Left, right, company, halt! During the drill, the Indians sat erect, watching the display. They did not speak or smile or gesture. At the end of the parade, Clark ordered the men to fire a volley. On command, the men fired their muskets. The loud noise startled the Oto braves. Seaman sprang to his feet and stood his body tensely. After the captains gave the at-ease commands, they joined the Indians under the sail. Lewis took charge of the meeting. So Seaman padded over to Clark and settled down beside him. While Lewis made a speech, Clark took notes. Some of the explorers had learned to speak a few Indian words when they had been trappers. They knew how to make hand signals that the Plains tribes used for trading with other tribes. They did their best to interpret Lewis's English so that the Indians could understand. Lewis explained that the land west of the Mississippi River belonged to the United States now. The French had sold their territory in what was called the Louisiana Purchase. Lewis likened the situation to adopting a family. He told the Ottos that they were children of the new father. This new father was President Thomas Jefferson. Lewis said that the new father wanted to have peaceful relationships with all of his children. The whites would become the Indians' trading partners, and everybody would grow rich. Lewis spoke for a half an hour. He encouraged the Indians to be friendly and helpful members of their new family. He told them to be peaceful with neighbors and the other Indian tribes, but he also warned that the Ottos caused trouble. I'm sorry, y'all, I keep losing my place. But he also warned that the Ottos caused trouble and that they would be sorry. He said that President Jefferson was the greatest chief of the 17th great nations of America. And he described how powerful the United States was with the trained armies and many weapons. If the Ottos tried to fight, they would be punished as severely as the fire consumes the grass of the plains. The Indians listened politely. Then their chief stood up and made a short speech. He told the captains that he was glad that they had come in peace. He agreed to follow Lewis's suggestions. He said he was looking forward to the gifts of his new white father. The captains gave a few small presents to the Otto visitors, medals, cloth, and a little bit of ammunition and whiskey. When the Indians stood to leave, Seaman jumped to his feet. He stood close to Lewis, his legs, and the captains waved goodbye. The men packed up to continue traveling, and the captains discussed their first meeting with the Indians. As he talked, Lewis knelt beside Seaman and stroked his fur. "I think it went well," Lewis said. "What do you think, William?" "I'm not sure how much of your speech the Ottos understood," Clark said, "but they seemed friendly enough. I think that they were pleased with our gifts." As the men pushed the boats into the river, they joked and laughed like schoolboys at recess. They had finally met some Indians, and things had gone so well. Coulter peeled off his shirt and threw himself into the water. He called Seaman to swim with him, and the two splashed around until the keelboat crew yelled for Coulter to take his pole. A few days after the meeting with the Ottos on the 8th of August, Lewis was sitting in the cabin of the keelboat with his samples spread out around him. Seaman sat beside him, sniffing the collection of dried leaves and animal skeletons. Lewis weighed and measured, sketched and noted. As he wrote, he asked himself how he could describe what he was finding in the wilderness so that the scientists living in a big city like Philadelphia would be able to understand. Suddenly, Seaman stood up. The smell of the birds was blowing over the river. He stuck his head out of the cabin and woofed. The smell was very strong. "Captain, look at this!" called one of the men in front of the boat. Lewis rushed to the bow of the keelboat with Seaman at his heels. The river turned into a gigantic desert. The river had turned into a gigantic dessert. When there's two S's, that means you want more. It's dessert. Sorry about that. It looked like it was covered with whipped cream, all white and frothy. Actually, their boats were moving into the sea of white feathers that stretched as far as Lewis could see. 3 miles passed, and still the feathers blanketed the surface of water 70 yards wide. Finally, a sandbar came into view. Lewis whistled, astonished. So many white pelicans stood on the sandbar that the ground beneath their feet could not even be seen. The skinny, long-legged birds are poking their beaks in their feathers to clean themselves. As they preened, some of their feathers fell out and blew into the river. As the keelboat approached the sandbar, mosquitoes swarmed, thick as fog. Seaman rubbed them out of his eyes with his paw, shaking his head to dislodge the pets. He lay down and covered his eyes and nose with his front legs. The men ran their sleeves across their faces and beat the air around them to drive off the insects. Fascinated, Lewis watched pelicans until the keelboat rounded the bend of the river. "Come on, fellow," he said, ruffling Seaman's fur. "It seems like we have our work cut out for us. Just as I thought, we were caught up with our field notes, and we have a new wonder to discover for the scientists back in Philadelphia." He strode back with the boat's captain, thinking about how he could make his words convey a picture of a sandbar coated with pelicans and a river of white with their feathers. The expedition faced its first serious problem as soon after the sighting of the pelicans. First, one of the privates requested permission to return to an earlier camp to get his knife, which he claimed he had left behind on accident. When the private did not return in a few days, the captain began to suspect that he had deserted. They examined his bags and found that he had taken all of his belongings. Quickly, they sent a party to find and capture him. 10 days later, the deserter was brought back, and he confessed. Not only had he deserted, but he had also stolen a rifle and ammunition as punishment. He had to run the gauntlet. 4 times, the men lined up facing each other and deserter to run between them. Each of the men whipped or beat the guilty man until he ran through the gauntlet. Although the private had been chosen to be part of the Corps of Discovery, the captains, he decided not to keep him in the permanent party of explorers. The following spring,